would now like to start our panel discussion on human rights violations by transnational corporations and the mismanagement of hazardous substances. I would first like to make a brief statement. The Special Rapporteur on Hazardous Substances and Waste presented his mission report to the Republic of Korea yesterday, and we would first like to thank him for his recommendations, especially to Samsung Electronics and Oxy Kaiser. As you may all know, as outlined in the Special Rapporteur's report, many people were killed or suffering from permanent disabilities caused by humidifier disinfectants. Most of the currently identified 4,000 victims are women and infants, and Oxy Kaiser, one of the main manufacturers, cannot sell these products in the UK where they're based, but exploited weak laws and used scientific fraud to sell them in Korea. Workers in Samsung Electronics factories are suffering from leukemia and other serious diseases due to toxic exposures in so-called clean rooms. Samsung violates a basic tenet of chemical safety by claiming health and safety information about workers, exposures to the confidential business information, or trade secrets. The company further undermines resolution of the issue by refusing even to talk to Sharps, a principal civil society organization that includes victims. Northeast Asia has been described as the factory of the world, and this has a human cost. Human rights violations arising from the use and production of hazardous substances sickens workers in many industries, including the toy and automobile factories in China and electronics industry in Taiwan. We would like to take this opportunity to share information on cases of human rights violations caused by the use of hazardous substances by transnational corporations, and also to discuss different ways to reduce the adverse human rights impacts of the activities of these corporations. First, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Ashut Tunjat, the Special Rapporteur on Hazardous Substances and Waste. He will give a presentation on how to implement the guiding principles on business and human rights in order to mitigate these adverse impacts of the activities of transnational corporations.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to speak with you today. I'm going to first maybe start by giving a brief introduction to the mandate. The mandate's been around for many years now, but it's undergone some changes in the recent years, and it still has a relatively low level of awareness, I would say, amongst the international community. So, some of you might be aware the mandate was created in the mid-90s in response to cases of illegal dumping of waste, primarily in developing countries. The mandate has been very closely associated with African countries for that reason, the African group as a whole. But in 2011, the mandate expanded very significantly, and in a very appropriate way, I would add. The mandate is now the mandate on hazardous substances and wastes, meaning that it covers the full life cycle of toxic chemicals, pollution, and other possible insults to human health. This includes extractive industries, it includes manufacturing activities, consumer products which may contain hazardous substances, and of course it still includes the issue of waste. So with that in mind, I've been at the mandate now for 2 years. I've had the opportunity to take 3 missions so far. One to Kazakhstan, one to South Korea, and another one to Germany. And we have another mission to the United Kingdom coming up in November. Throughout these country visits and other cases that have been brought to my attention, several trends have emerged. I was asked to comment on a few of those, so I'll just briefly summarize them. The first observation that I would make is that there is widespread exposure and impacts on human rights. These include the right to life, to survival, to development, to health, to an adequate standard of living, including safe food, safe water, adequate housing, information, participation, and remedy have also been implicated in many of these cases. In all 3 country missions I've conducted so far, children have been impacted by hazardous substances and vices. I just presented a report to the Human Rights Council, which argues that states have a duty to prevent childhood exposure to toxics and pollution. This flows at the nexus of many rights contained in the International Covenant or Convention on Child Rights, as well as other international covenants. In particular, Article 24 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child states very clearly that every child has the right to the highest attainable standard of health. States have an obligation to take into consideration the dangers and risks of contamination and pollution in the realization of this right. In the course of my mission to South Korea, the case of oxyrechet-benckiser came to my attention. Some of you might be familiar with this case, but for those that aren't, it involved a humidifier sterilizer, which was sold on the market for consumers to add to their water tanks, meaning that in the humidifier would be dispersed inside the home. The product contained toxic chemicals that were untested and grossly underregulated in terms of their potential human health impacts, in particular to young children. As a result, over 90 people now have been confirmed to have died as a result of this toxic product. It's believed that over 1,000 victims have had their health and other rights impacted as a result. In another case involving pesticides in Peru, there is a large multinational, transnational corporation, Bayer Crop Sciences, which now is posed to be even larger following its merger with Monsanto, which sold allegedly a pesticide that was banned in Germany in Peru. And this pesticide was mistakenly added to school lunches, thinking that it was powdered milk. 24 children died, another 26 were injured. Neither the survivors nor the families of those who died have had an effective remedy, or any remedy for that matter. Also in the mission to South Korea, we were presented with the unique vulnerability of workers. As I mentioned to the council, workers are typically allowed to be exposed to toxic chemicals at hundreds, sometimes thousands of times higher than the average population, so-called permissible exposure levels. Everyone has the right, particularly in South Korea, under the Constitution, to a healthy workplace. The children have the right to be free from the worst forms of child labor, which the ILO has defined to include hazardous substances, which they may use in their occupations or jobs. The case of Samsung Electronics, SK Hynix, and others within the electronics industry was certainly one that came to the fore during the course of this mission. We had the opportunity to speak with victims. We had the opportunity to speak with companies several times. We had the opportunity to speak with attorneys, judges, the government. We took a tour of the facilities. And one thing that never became apparent, not during the mission, not during any of the subsequent follow-up, was that the working conditions of those facilities were safe at the time of these alleged incidents. These incidents are cases of various cancers, leukemia, lymphoma, lung cancer, a host of other cancers, and others that have allegedly been tied to working conditions at the time at Samsung Electronics, SK Hynix, and others. I was pleased with some aspects of the progress that was made in the subsequent months, including what I think is a very useful way forward in terms of this ombudsman committee that was established, which should be implemented quickly. But one thing that concerns me regarding the ombudsman committee in particular is that it's time limited. prevention measures that this Ombudsman Committee is supposed to be implementing. It's difficult to imagine a situation where those prevention measures, the need for them, would ever go away. The industry is very dynamic. The threats will change over time, the toxic threats, that is. And this Ombudsman Committee, in my view, should be something that continues on and continues to develop good and better practices as the industry continues to develop itself. In addition, some of the other trends that we saw were marginalized communities, whether they're low-income communities, migrant workers, or otherwise marginalized groups who are disproportionately impacted by a range of potential exposures, whether it's an industrial facility, a power plant, or an extractive industry project. In Kazakhstan, we saw the situation of Beryazovka, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, where community literally on the fence line, just on the margins of a so-called sanitary protection zone, saw cases of seizures. The source of those seizures is believed to be a large-scale oil and gas condensate field right next door to their homes. 24 children suddenly, in 2014, developed seizures. The seizures continued for many months. Children, as well as a few adults, were affected by an unknown culprit, believed to be some of the pollutants that were released from this oil and gas condensate field. Other communities, indigenous peoples in Peru, there's a long-standing case of Lot 192, which used to be known as Lot 1AB. It was operated for about 2 decades by the U.S. petroleum company, Occidental, which was later taken over by an Argentinian company called Petrol. And for 40 years, there have been widespread oil spills, oil leaks from a pipeline in this community. And the leaks continue to this day. However, the community has never had any sort of remediation of these spills. When Petrol took over, they were supposed to clean up the spills that were left behind from Occidental. That hasn't taken place. And so the impacts continue on that community. We've also seen cases where the elderly have been impacted. We've seen communities that are largely over the age of 60 that are suffering from very high levels of cancer, respiratory illnesses, and other impacts on their health, whether it's from a power plant, whether it's from a military base. And so these are some of the communities that I would say are at disproportionate risk. But the reality throughout these missions is that everyone is exposed to varying levels of hazardous substances. And this raises many questions in my mind for human rights and the role of the state in protecting people from exposure. One of the other trends I've seen is that increasing risks and harms are being transferred to developing countries and countries with economies in transition. Some of the cases I've mentioned illustrate that. We've seen the export of pesticides that are banned in one country, but still being exported to other countries where they have yet to be banned. I also noticed in the course of these missions great confusion about what human rights has to do with toxics. This includes both amongst government as well as businesses. There's been some disagreement, I would say, about what human rights means in terms of protecting people from exposure versus the measures that are in place, which are largely premised on risk assessment. And a risk assessment is essentially accepting that some percentage of the population will have a disease or an adverse outcome, rather than accepting that everyone is entitled to these rights universally. There's also been discussions about the right to information, the right to participation, the right to an effective remedy, and how that intersects with hazardous substances and wastes. But one thing in all the missions so far that is featured is seen limited access to an effective remedy. We've seen poor governance. We've seen fragmented legislation that leaves many, many gaps. And increasingly, we've been seeing deregulation, a lowering of standards by countries in the hopes of either increasing investment, increasing jobs, increasing economic growth, and very limited international cooperation, whether it's under treaties or at on a bilateral level. Quickly, I'll just highlight two principles in instances of violation that I was asked to touch upon. One of the principles is accountability. Accountability both in terms of to the victims, in compensation, but also accountability to the broader society in terms of criminal prosecutions that certainly are warranted in many of these cases. The second principle I'll mention is the principle of non-recurrence. In many cases, take for example the São Marco disaster in Brazil, there's a slow, if not non-existent, recognition in some cases of the need to have adequate preventative measures, and that these are not isolated incidents that cannot be prevented. It's simply an accident that was unforeseeable. And third, across almost all the cases, there has been a desire of the victims to have a sincere apology. And I think this is very important and something that's often overlooked and not emphasized enough. So many of these cases are not uplifting, some are quite depressing. But there are some good practices that have developed over the years, and I just want to touch on a few of those. In terms of prevention, the one that I think really jumps out at me is the approach of the EU when it comes to carcinogens, mutagens, reprotoxicants, the so-called hazard-based approach, where if a chemical has those intrinsic hazards of a certain magnitude, of a certain certainty, it's prohibited from being used within the country. This applies to pesticides. It also applies to toys, protecting children from carcinogens and other toxic chemicals, and to a lesser degree, within the REACH regulation of the EU as well. There's also been examples from the US, for example, with great cooperation between environmental agencies and law enforcement agencies. In the US, the Department of Justice, cooperating on prosecution of cases where the violation of a healthy environment is a crime. And I think that's something that increasingly countries need to look to, because these cases are increasingly criminal in nature. The right to information and participation. Again, from the US, we have the Toxics Release Inventory, which has enabled pollution to be cross-referenced with census data to give greater clarity to where there may be cases of discrimination and where there may be cases where greater precautions may be warranted. Again, from the EU, the REACH regulation, the principle of no doubt in the market, and of course biomonitoring, which I think is very important in terms of moving people and regulators towards assessing which chemicals are in our bodies in real time. And finally, in terms of a remedy, the Liability Act in the Republic of Korea. I think this is one piece of legislation really from the mission that I thought was very good practice in terms of shifting the burden of proof away from the victims and moving closer towards placing greater burden on industries that are likely to have committed crimes. So I encourage the government and civil society to continue to push for the implementation of this legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chajak. Before we move to our next presentation, I would first like to give a proper introduction. I forgot to do this at the beginning of the discussion. I apologize. My name is Seung-gi Hong from the Korea Center for United Nations Human Rights Policy. And Now I will give the floor to Mr. Jason Chan from Labor Action China. He will present some cases of violations arising from the mismanagement of hazardous substances in China and also in Taiwan.
Thank you, Sandy. And it's a great pleasure to have a special rapporteur here today. And just a little bit unfortunate that our Taiwanese partner cannot be here, so I am speaking on their behalf. They want me to pass on the message is that on April the 17th, 2015, the Taipei District Court ordered a partial judgment in favor of the plaintiffs of the RCA. RCA is Radio Corporation of America, RCA Employee Care Association, and this actually ends the 11-year litigation. And our friends from Taiwan, Taoy, and the RCA Employee Care Association organized protests since 1998 and bring lawsuits to the U.S. companies such as RCA and later the French owner. So right now, although the first initial litigation is finished, but then they have increased the number of victims, employees, to more than 1,500. So both sides, both employer and employees, they are both appealing to the High Court. And from our friends, which states that when RCA was operating in Taiwan, it actually found violations of the regulations, which include using organic solvents and of course, by that time, the health record was poorly kept by the company, and also they have the problem of installing popular ventilation to prevent the problem, and also they found there's not sufficient protective equipment was provided, and also the label of this harmful material was not populated. So that actually caused the direct exposure of employees to this carcinogenic substance at work. And quite lucky that the court actually established the causal link for the workers, so which is quite out of their surprise. So which is quite similar to what Special Rapporteur said. But at the same time, these harmful effects are irreversible. So many of these workers, they were diagnosed with liver cancer, lung cancer, stomach cancer, bone cancer, lymphoma, breast cancer, and every other different kinds of occupational cancer. And these employees are 20 to 100 times higher than the general population in terms of contracting this cancer. So basically, this is quite a significant instance in terms of damage caused to workers. So this is what's the message that our Taiwanese NGOs want to pass it on, although they cannot be here today. But now I want to quickly shift to China because, of course, I am a NGO working in China on OSH issues. So from my experience, we actually document quite a number of cases in different sectors, including electronics industry, footwear, toy, and even for making containers. So they are all exposed to benzene or other hazardous chemical. And quite similar to what Mr. Chunker said, the Chinese victims, they are having a serious problem of proving the causation. And that means, well, if these workers, they could not get the official diagnosis, so they would not be able to award any statutory work-related injury benefits, or even being able to get hold of the company, of the employers to get civil compensation according to the law. So this is really, really problematic. And of course, well, one thing which I would like to emphasize is because chemical poisoning has such a long latency period, maybe sometimes more than 10 years from our study. And like what Mr. Tunker said yesterday, well, these suppliers actually changed a lot in the past decade. So that means, well, workers, they are having is the very short-term contract, maybe 3 years or even less, up to 1 year. So that means, well, they might, before they realize that they're actually become the victims, they have already changed employers for a few times. So that means, well, that would be very, very difficult for them to show that, well, their problems is related to one or the other employers. And of course, well, the other thing is, which I would like to emphasize, is about the prevention. Prevention is very important, as we all know, because, well, if the problem can be curbed at the beginning, so lots of workers would not fall ill. But from our study, we actually found that lots of employees, they are not given proper protective, personal protective equipment. So they would be just given very flimsy gloves or just a surgical mask. So they have to work with this chemical more than 12 or 13 hours a day. So when we looked at these standards, well, even though, well, the Chinese standard, but then, well, you know, the time of exposure is not 8 hours as the standards say, but it's much higher. But of course, well, they might encounter a mixture of different chemicals at work every single day. So that actually makes the situation worse. And what I also want to mention is the right to know is also important, because when in our study, when we approach these workers, asking them what kind of chemicals that they would use at work, they always give some funny names to us, such as banana water. When we ask them, what is banana water? Can you give us more information? They cannot, because these chemicals are not properly labeled. So they can tell you banana waters because the chemical smells like banana. So if they can tell you thinners, we are lucky because we know what thinner is, but then banana waters, it is very difficult for many NGO workers like us, especially when we don't have a chemistry degree. So this is the main 2 points which I would like to highlight. But of course, well, if you want to know more about the situation in China, we just published our report with SOMO. This is the research that we have conducted in the southern part of China last year, and the report is available there. If you really want to know, then please get hold of a copy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chen. Now I would like to give the floor to Ms. Yongman Won from SHARPS.
Good afternoon. My name is Won Young-eun, came from Korea. I am a representative of a public interest NGO SHARPS. I would like to introduce consumers and workers damaged from toxic chemical. I want to show a few photos. what happened to the health people? It's Korean. Yeah, I translate. For my baby. For my baby, use the humidifier infectant. It's an advertisement. The government and a few companies recruit the humidifier and make sure using humidifier disinfectant is advertisement. Without verifying safety, they have advertised. With the secure component to the human body, you can use without injecting. In Korea, 9 million people were estimated to use a humidifier for adjusting the indoor humidity. The corporation claims humidifier disinfectants were good for health. Since 1994, more than 20 brands sold 600,000 humidifier disinfectants every year. According to the Asian Citizen Center for Environment and Health, there are over 4,000 identified victims, more than 900 of which that have lost their lives. In particular, infants and mothers, pregnant women were damaged seriously. This tragedy is directly relevant to the report of the Special Rapporteur at this meeting and his recommendation on the children rights. Korean government failed in protection of people for years. For 9 years since 2002, when the first case of death was profiled, the government did nothing. Finally, in 2011, the government and a few companies recalled the humidifier disinfectant. Currently, the number of potential victims is estimated as many as 2 million. This year, parliamentary audit was done, focusing on the responsibility of the companies and the government. Workers of Samsung Electronics have been suffering from cancers and incurable illness related to work. The number of workers' illness and deaths from electronic industry in South Korea documented by my organization is 368. At least 134 of them have already passed away. Yeah. Most of the reports came from Samsung. About 80 of 299 cases of Samsung have filed the workers' compensation. Only few of them could get the compensation due to burden of proof and the trade secret. 4% of them received nothing for their death and illness. Why many workers are sick? Samsung has dominated memory chip makers since the early 1990s. Toxic and often carcinogen materials are commonly used to produce semiconductor mobile phone and LCD. Samsung claims chemical management system is rigorous, but clean room is not safe. The clean room is clean for the product, not for the workers. The bunny suit is designed to protect a product from dust, not to protect the workers from chemical exposure. Victims file compensation to the government, but it is difficult for them to be recognized as occupational disease. Why? Because of Samsung. Samsung keeps it is even worse that they cannot get compensation because of Samsung's disturbance. The victims has been suffering from double burden. Peoples in Europe may be surprised to face this chemical tragedy in Korea because it is impossible to sell any chemicals products without safety information in Europe. The European Union had a slogan, no data, no problem, based on REACH system since the 2007. But in Korea, no data, no problem. The humidifier disinfectants company OCD is based in the United Kingdom. They are well aware that they could not sell products containing hazardous substances within the EU because they were a member of the EU that was bound by REACH at that time. However, they sold these toxic products in Korea, where regulation on hazardous substances are far weaker. This is the standard program. As long as this problem exists, the rally of death cannot stop. The route is following to the less sensitive to the risk and less regulatory area. Victims are struggling in every way. Asking the corporation responsibility, lawsuit to ensure justification, appeal for the government, media activity, solidarity, fighting in the street. Victims are struggling in every way. The reason why I came here is so one of the efforts. We appreciate special attention to this effort. Is that Korean powers do not protect workers. South Korean law bars government agency from withholding public health and safety information. We demand UN Human Rights Council should not overlook the dangers of chemicals and ask Samsung and the governments responsible for regulating this issue until we hope UN Human Council can make a strong recommendation and Korean government will fully implement this recommendation. Full implementation of human rights principles would prevent these types of tragedy from happening in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kwon. Ms. Kwon has been working with victims for a very long time. She is very passionate about this issue. Thank you for your presentation. I would now like to give the floor to Ms. Sarah Brooks from the International Service for Human Rights. She will deliver a presentation on using UN mechanisms for reform and accountability at home. Thank you.
Thank you. So I wanted to say that it's very hard to come after these two presentations that have highlighted so much the challenges at the domestic level and the everyday work of human rights defenders who are working within their own communities and within their own jurisdictions to try and seek remedy and accountability for human rights violations related to the exposure to and non-regulation of hazardous substances and wastes. What I would like to do is maybe to take a step back and to speak a little bit about three things that I think have come up from the presentations today and well as to provide some hope of remedy. And so the three thematic issues that really came out, I think, from this discussion for me were, one, the challenges of access to information, both supported by governments, but then also supported through media and access publicly to information about cases. The second is the challenge of holding corporations accountable. So really looking at that second pillar of the guiding principles and what corporate responsibility to respect human rights really means in the context of global supply chains and evolving business relationships. And then third, and I think this is perhaps most relevant to ISHR's mandate, given our role in supporting and empowering human rights defenders to use the UN system for national level change, is the limits that individuals seeking to support victims and seeking accountability face in doing that work, that important work of protecting human rights. So to go to the first, we'll just kind of jump right in, the access to information and sort of freedom of expression issues. I think the Special Rapporteur has also started to speak out about this, and when he referenced the evolution of the mandate, I think this is one thing that to me has been really important, and that he's been able to highlight within the context of his mandate how important it is that journalists be able to report on incidences of exposure to hazardous waste, in particular industrial accidents. I think this is incredibly important, and it's something that's further been supported by the Working Group on Business and Human Rights. In June of this year, they released a report on access to remedy that included significant components addressing the need for governments to both protect media and ensure press freedoms, but perhaps most importantly for this, to ensure access to information, including information held by private sources. So I think that's one important report and one tool that the international system has provided to defenders on the ground. The second, in terms of the challenges in seeking corporate accountability, this is something that is, I think, evolving both through the work of the working group as well as through a number of other channels. The increasing uptake of national action plans that encourage governments to be, as they should, those primarily responsible for protecting human rights, but also encouraging governments to do so through implementing regulations that require companies to disclose human rights hazards, to conduct human rights due diligence, and to engage meaningfully with victims and with victims' communities and victims' advocates. I think this is incredibly important. The third sort of element of how to tackle multinational corporations and how to seek accountability is actually very timely. So it's the open-ended intergovernmental working group on a treaty to address the challenges of transnational corporations and human rights violations. So the process is well underway here in Geneva, and we'll meet at the end of October, from 24th to 28th October this year, to continue to discuss what the content of this treaty would be. And I encourage all of you